Hi everyone, welcome to a pre-recording of our 8th lecture on language and lateralization. This pre-recording will give you an overview of the key facts in chapter 13 of our textbook. For more details, please attend my lecture in person. We shall start with language. Language is a system of communicating thoughts and feelings using arbitrary signals, such as sounds, gestures, or written signals. The origins of language. We do have genes related to different aspects of language, such as FOXP2 in chromosome 7, which show important mutations about 100,000 years ago. And interestingly, there are also the presence of click languages used by certain African groups. If you are free, please go and watch the YouTube video. Communication in non-human animals. We have many animals that communicate with one another, and some animals are suspected of having language, such as great apes, whales, dolphins, parrots, dogs. So we have examples in the form of Einstein, the African grey parrot, and Concise, the chimpanzee. Please watch these YouTube videos if you're available. So we have Atchinson's 10 criteria for language. This table is taken from our textbook. There are a lot of words. I will not read them out one by one. I just want everybody to focus on the last category of creativity, which is highly unique to highly intelligent animals like us. So multilingualism, I want everybody to know that more than half of the world's population is bilingual, and the language learned at a younger age is retained better. And bilingualism seems to be associated with a number of positive outcomes. Bilingual children perform better on tests of executive control. Bilingualism is also associated with a delay in the onset of age-related dementia. Please remember the last point. So on this slide, we look at bilingualism and gray matter density. So interestingly, the left inferior parietal cortex shows higher gray matter densities in bilinguals. And when you look at the correlational graph, you can see that the proficiency in second language is positively correlated with gray matter density in this left inferior parietal cortex. By contrast, the age of acquisition of second language is correlated negatively with gray matter density in the same brain region. And so this means that the younger you are in learning the second language, the higher your gray matter density in that brain region. So sign language, okay, we have American Sign Language, very famous. We also have the Australian Sign Language, another very famous sign language. So research in neuroscience has shown that sign language is processed in the same brain regions as verbal language. Communication disorders and brain mechanisms for language. So we have a lot of case studies of individuals who lose some aspects of language due to strokes or other types of brain damage. And that shows the importance of the localization of language functions, right? So now we have to turn to aphasias. So it all started with Paul Broca. He is a French scientist, and his patient, who is just called Tan, right? So Broca studied a 51-year-old man who had been institutionalized for more than 20 years. And he is unable to produce words, and mostly he's muttering "tan" when answering questions. So he's basically called tan. So after his brain autopsy, it was found that tan had significant damage to the left inferior frontal region, which we now call Broca's area. And that area is now believed to play a large role in speech production. So on this slide, I put double asterisks, right? So this is highly important. So aphasia, by definition, is a total or partial loss of the ability to either produce and or comprehend language. So broadcast aphasia refers to the lack of ability to speak clearly, right? So patient 10 is very non-fluent, and the comprehension is largely intact. It is not totally, but it is largely intact. And interestingly, comprehension difficulties for people with broadcast aphasia are specific to understanding action-related verbs. So they cannot group words like jogging and running within the same category. On the other hand, we have Wernicke's aphasia, which refers to deficits in comprehension without being aware that one cannot comprehend. So I put an exclamation mark to show the surprising aspect of this fact. And speech is rapid and fluent, but ungrammatical and often meaningless. And now we go to the third aphasia, which is called conduction aphasia. It is called conduction because of damage to arcuate fasciculus linking Broca's and Wernicke's area. It is less severe than either Broca's or Wernicke's aphasia, right? So the speech remains fluent, but comprehension is fairly good, right? And there is difficulty with repeating sentences, naming pictures, objects, assembling phonemes into words. So there is some phonological deficits. And when we look at global aphasia, the fourth type, right? So it is a most severe type involving damages to Broca's and Wernicke's areas, arcuate fasciculus, etc., right, nearby areas. And there is loss of nearly all language functions, right? To speak, to comprehend, read and write, they're all impaired. And surprisingly, the person can still swear and curse and comprehend some words. Yeah. And now we look at the fifth type of aphasia, which is transcortical aphasias divided into two subtypes. So the first is transcortical motor aphasia, difficulty with producing speech. It is very much like Broca's aphasia, right? Because the area is very close to Broca's area. But people with this kind of motor aphasia, they can still repeat sentences, right? And now we look at transcortical sensory aphasia. So they will have difficulty with comprehension, naming pictures, objects, very much like Wernicke's aphasia. But they can still retain grammatical speech, right? This is different from Wernicke's aphasia. And people with sensory aphasia, they can still repeat sentences, just like people with motor aphasia. So now we look at language models, right? So the most famous language model involving aphasia, of course, is the Wernicke-Geschwind model, right, from 1965. And so there's 3 bullet points, 3 pieces of information. Specifically, the Broca area is proposed to be responsible for speech production. The Wernicke area is seen as responsible for speech comprehension. And lastly, the arcuate fasciculus, the white matter tract connecting the Wernicke area to the Broca's area, it is important for speech repetition. And we have a more contemporary language model called the Interacting Language Components model by Dronkers et al. So we have 3 layers of components, and starting from language implementation. So it's like a decoding system, right, that makes sense of incoming verbal information, and it tries to produce appropriate verbal responses. And involves Broca-Wernicke's area, the insular basal ganglia areas. And then there's this mediational system, which is like a relay system, okay, that manages communication between the implementation and the third system below, which is the conceptual system. So all you have to remember is that this is a relay system, and it involves the association cortex. So the last and perhaps the most, the highest system, right, is called the conceptual system, involving managing semantic knowledge. So it's involved in processing the meaning of the verbal information. And it involves higher level association areas, and it's not restricted to the left hemisphere alone. right? So now the third kind of language model is what we call the dual stream models, not just one, but a collection of it. So, but the kind of concept they propose is similar, right? So it involves a dorsal pathway and a ventral pathway, just like what we have in our visual processing system. So the dorsal pathway is involved in the conversion of sound to movements of speech, right? Such as, when we are learning to pronounce a word, right? So our dorsal pathway will be involved. And the areas involved will be the superior temporal gyrus and the frontal lobe, right? As for the ventral pathway, it is involved in the conversion of sound to meaning, such as hearing a word and knowing what it means, right? Extremely important. Like, you are now listening to me, you have to make sense of what I am speaking, right? It involves connection from superior temporal gyrus to the middle and inferior temporal gyri, as you can see on the diagram. And now we look at deficits related to reading and writing. So we have something called alexia. It is called pure word blindness. You won't be read or recognize letters. However, your normal speech is intact, and there are disruptions in pathways connecting area involved in visual recognition of letters with language areas. And we also have agraphia. So you have deficits in writing, and there will be damage to motor areas. And now we turn to dyslexia, which we all know refers to a difficulty in learning to read, right? And there's also a genetic component, right, involving the plantar temporal. Yeah. So there's less left-right differences in this area in people with dyslexia versus controls, right? And people with dyslexia, normally they have very poor phonological awareness. And as such, there is huge recommendation for early remedial treatment before the 3rd grade. Yeah. Now we look at the brain areas involved in dyslexia. So during reading, dyslexics show little or no activation in angular gyrus and vernicus area. Note that the angular gyrus is very close to the vernicus area. Okay, and this kind of finding is tied to poor comprehension, right, for dyslexics. And there is higher activation in Broca's area. Okay, so remember the Broca area is tied to speech production. So this kind of finding can be seen as tied to higher mental effort expended by dyslexics compared to non-dyslexics, right? Now we turn to brain lateralization. Okay, so here is a picture of our brain from above. So we have 2 hemispheres, right, with the corpus callosum linking both of them. And hemispheric asymmetry and its behavior correlates, right? Note that organisms are not perfectly symmetrical, right? Our physical structure, our organs are not perfectly symmetrical. Asymmetry extends to our brains as well. And lateralization is a localization of a function in one hemisphere or the other. So interestingly, we have this surgery called hemispherectomy, right? And specifically, it is used to treat Rasmussen's syndrome. Okay, it is a very rare inflammatory brain disease affecting children below 10 years old. And so usually such young children, they suffer from some kind of epileptic seizures. And one of the hemisphere is being cut out, resected. So when performed in children, the only side effect is a slight limp. And there can be greater side effects, right? If this was performed in adults, right? This can lead to headache, depression, etc. And now we look at the split brain surgery. It is also known as corpus callosotomy because it involves the severing of the corpus callosum. Yeah. So the split brain surgery, in a nutshell, right? It involves the pathways connecting the right and left cerebral hemispheres. They are severed, right? There will be no noticeable changes in personality, intelligence, or speech, right? Somewhat surprising. and language and logical thought were found, right, to be localized to the left hemisphere, and spatial cognition processing were found to be localized to the right hemisphere. This is based on the brain surgery evidence. Now we turn to experiments on the split brain patient as shown by Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga. Right, so as we learn from our vision lecture, we know that certain parts from our visual field from both eyes goes contralaterally to the other brain hemisphere. Right, so in this case, we have this patient, split brain patient. He is looking at the word heart, right? And the word heart is separated into he and ART. So when he's looking at it, he goes to his right hemisphere and art goes to his left hemisphere. And so when he is being asked what word did he see, right? Then, after the disappearance of HEART, right, he will report that he sees the word art, right? Because that is what is being processed by his left hemisphere, which is predominantly involved in language processing. And however, when he's being asked to point at, what he saw, right, he will point to he, right, with his left hand, right? This is because the word he is being processed by his right brain hemisphere, and his right brain hemisphere controls the movement of his left hand. And that is why he will point to the word he. We now look at the water test. So the water test involves the anesthetization of one hemisphere with injection of sodium amytal. So in this case, the left hemisphere of this patient was sedated. And once the left hemisphere is sedated, he will be unable to find a word for spoon, right? And for most people, the language is located in the left hemisphere. We know that from the previous slide, right? But he can still recognize the spoon with his left hand. And now here's a famous book on split brain patients. This is written by Michael Gazzaniga, right? He is considered as one of the fathers of cognitive neuroscience. So please look out for this book after this module. So now we look at dichotic listening. So when we have conflicting information sent to two ears, right, the person will tend to show a preference for the word received by the right ear, right? So in this case, the person will repeat ga because ga is sent to his right hemisphere. Contemporary imaging studies using fMRI and DTI show lateralization hubs. So the left hemisphere has been shown to be highly involved in language, while the right has been shown to be highly involved in attention and executive functioning. So lateralization and microscopic analysis have also shown early stages of neurogenesis, right? So such as progenitor cell proliferation, which is responsible for cortical asymmetries. The evolution of lateralization. Lateralization is found in many species. For example, dogs in general have a preferred paw. Around 70% of dogs have a clear paw preference. And this is also shown in mice, rats, cats, etc. Adaptive advantages of lateralization pertain to enhanced skill performance, faster reaction times, improving divided attention abilities, and such lateralization can also be useful for language and language-like functions, for instance, gesture. So here's an example taken from chicks on lateralization and multitasking. Right, so lateralization had been found to improve divided attention abilities in chicks, and such chicks were raised either in the dark or in the light. And the chick feeds while the model raptor moves in one visual field. And chicks raised in the light show lateralized feeding and predator search behavior. They're quicker to respond when the predator impacted the left eye, as shown in the diagram. And chicks raised in the dark do not show lateralization, simply because they couldn't see the direction of travel of the raptor. Now we turn to the development of lateralization. The role of prenatal androgens can determine the extent of lateralization. There is a prenatal hormone hypothesis emphasizing prenatal testosterone determining the extent of lateralization. And we also have CAH from lecture 5, speculating that stronger lateralization of language but not handedness is related to CAH. And the two hemispheres also appear to develop along different timelines. 2/3 of human fetuses maintain a right side outward position during final trimester. And this can possibly lead to an asymmetry of auditory input that influence the developing brain. There is also a maturation of left hemisphere lagging behind the right hemisphere during the first year of life, but then the trend flips. We now have a question. Is handedness related to the lateralization of language? In other words, if you are right-handed, would you have a larger left brain, and vice versa for left-handers? So based on this research done in 2018 by Cohn et al., it was found that there was no significant associations between asymmetries and handedness. We now look at the lateralization of auditory processing. Different aspects of musical abilities are lateralized to left and right hemispheres, respectively. The plana temporale behind our auditory cortex is usually larger in left hemisphere than in right hemisphere in musicians with perfect pitch. And this asymmetry is more pronounced in such musicians as compared to non-musicians. By contrast, our right hemisphere responds more to expectations regarding harmonics than our left hemisphere. There are also sex differences in lateralization. According to the prenatal hormone hypothesis, it predicts the presence of sex differences in lateralization based on differences in hormonal patterns. Males show differences in lateralization patterns compared to females. So such brain lateralization differences may relate to behavior. Compared to females, males show stronger brain activations during visual spatial tasks in the right hemisphere. By contrast, compared to males, females show stronger brain activations during language-based tasks in the left hemisphere. On this slide, I want to show reduced LH lateralization in people with ASD. In controls without ASD, we can see there is LH lateralization of language-related functional connectivity, as indicated by the red rectangle. By contrast, when we look at people with ASD, there is reduced LH lateralization of language-related functional connectivity, as shown by the second red rectangle. A reminder to everybody before I end, please do the next set of 5 MCQs on your tutorial 7 slides. Do note that there will be no tutorial recordings for this week and week 9, since the slides are MCQs only and many need to present in my classes, right? So there is absolutely no time. Do note that I have a revision recording for week 10, which will be available on the 18th of September, Monday in week 10. It is a must watch.